Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, policies that ensure a truly brighter future need to embrace economic, social and environmental policy as equally important components rather than as competing considerations. 2 weeks ago, Bill English stood opposite and gave a 45-minute speech about tax. But switching indirect for direct tax is not an economic policy. Throwing together spending and revenue assumptions based on growth projections that will just disappear if, God forbid, the global financial crisis is not truly over, aren't one either. And cuts in real terms to research and development spending, education and health spending don't make for a social policy, sir. But these weren't the worst things about the budget. Bill English proved last week that he and the government in which he serves are truly anchored somewhere back in the 20th century, when in that entire 45-minute speech, Bill English didn't mention the environment once. So the government's rhetoric continues to set up this false distinction between the environment on the one hand and the economy on the other. And we saw this as recently as this morning in remarks made to the EDS conference in Auckland by the Minister for the Environment. The reality, sir, is that only by starting that transition to a lower pollution economy now can we ensure ongoing prosperity in the future. The warning signs are there for anybody who cares to see them. We had the KPMG report last month warning that our farmers' efficiency will be surpassed by those of developing countries like Uruguay in less than 5 years' time if we don't provide them with the means and the encouragement to really innovate. Many of our leading business people have already called on the government to promote clean tech investment, but at the same time we've got the Hamilton-based BioVitoria company that can raise onshore only $8 million of the $20 million it needs to commercialise that brilliant zero-calorie fruit-based sweetener. Those sort of initiatives are the ones where our future prosperity lies, and they can't get funding onshore, sir. Our trading partners are starting to build border tariff provisions into their domestic trade and climate change legislation so as to deal with imports from countries and jurisdictions that don't price greenhouse gases and carbon or don't do so adequately. And, sir, there's very high environmental awareness amongst inbound tourists and the purchasers of our goods in affluent offshore markets. But, sir, 2 weeks ago, Bill English turned a deaf ear to all those concerns and all those signs. Research and development, sir, to promote innovation, reduce primary production emissions and support the clean tech industries that we all know are the path to future sustainable prosperity should have been the priority in the budget. But the budget results in an almost complete absence of new business research and development spend. Why is that? Why is that? Because businesses will get assistance to conduct research and development through vouchers and grants, government handouts, sir, in other words. Now, in comparison, the tax credit that the Labour-led government put in place would have more than doubled New Zealand's business research and development spend over only its first 4 years, because it would have provided a heavy incentive for businesses to invest in research and development rather than just get the sort of handout that members opposite are so used to asking for from the government. And predictions, sir, remain that spending will just be static under this voucher policy that we've seen put in place. Mr. Speaker, this was a massive missed opportunity to increase our business research and development spend, which is woeful compared to other like-sized countries. National's decision to axe the 15% tax credit for research and development in 2008 is one that we will live to regret at our leisure, sir. Bill English was obsessed about the possibility of tax credits being gained, but Treasury thought that it could close those loopholes. And in the budget in Australia only a couple of weeks ago, that's exactly the approach that the Australians themselves took to research and development, closing the loopholes rather than just cutting off the incentives through the tax system. And that's why the government should have kept the research and development tax credit system. Sir, there's another absence of investment in the budget, and that's in the clean tech area. And again, this contrasts poorly with the record across the Tasman last month. There, despite much greater mineral wealth than here, Australia recognised the importance of clean tech investment as a source of future prosperity by providing a decent amount of government support for it. Some of our most innovative business leaders have been urging those members opposite, John Key and Bill English and their colleagues, to recognise the urgent importance of future-proofing our economy by making a similar investment. And what a tragedy, sir, that those calls have been ignored. Sir, the plain truth is that this government has no sustainable vision for New Zealand's future. Its actions show that its only strategy is to promote more intensive food production and more intensive minerals extraction. Get it out of the ground, ship it offshore to be consumed, and hope that that helps fix the balance of payments deficit. And on the way, shift as many costs to the taxpayer as possible and away from polluters themselves as they intensify their production or their extraction. Never mind the environmental consequences or our international reputation. Never mind where the allocation of risk is fair as between taxpayers and offshore businesses. Never mind if the profits actually stay in New Zealand to be invested in our future here. Mr. Speaker, if the government wasn't willing to invest in new environmental initiatives, then at the very least they might have compensated for the cuts they made in last year's budget. The budget documents contain no new initiatives to make up for the funds taken from Vote Environment or Vote Conservation last year. There's nothing to restore great initiatives like Enviro Schools, which had their funding slashed, nothing to make up for cutting any encouragement to government, accounting for 1/3 of this country's economic activity, to work in a carbon-neutral way. It's instructive, sir, that all Kate Wilkinson's press release about the budget could do was trumpet the building of cycle and walkways to be built, but failed to mention that there's no new investment here because DOC is expected to find funding for these initiatives out of its existing budget. Sir, there's no new funding for energy efficiency or conservation, outside of money already announced to meet the increased demand for home insulation by the Warm Up New Zealand scheme, which itself is a reworked version of Labour's home insulation scheme. So that was one of Labour's first complementary measures to be funded from the emissions trading scheme that we put in place. And National has replaced that scheme with a taxpayer-funded initiative worth less than half of what Labour legislated for, with no guarantee of ongoing funding after 4 years. So the government needs to ensure that everyone has access to warmer, drier, healthier and more energy-efficient homes. But there's no initiative in the budget to ensure that this will happen, just as adequate initiatives to encourage energy efficiency across the board, like truly smart meters accompanied by the availability of differential tariffs, are absent from the budget. Sir, a final word about the evident lack of commitment in the budget to fulfilling our country's climate change obligations. Sir, there's no money budgeted to pay for New Zealand's contribution to the mitigation and adaptation funds, which we agreed to contribute at the Copenhagen conference. This contrasts with the Australia $200 million committed in the Australian budget on 12 May for that purpose. Assuming New Zealand will need to make a comparable contribution on a prorated population basis and an exchange rate of 80 cents to the New Zealand dollar, there's just under $50 million missing from the budget on this score. Sir, there's no provision made for the 11-fold increase in firms eligible for a free allocation of carbon credits. The Minister for Climate Change Issues has fudged the figures here, but, sir, people will see through this. There's over $500 million carried forward to provide for the value of credits to foresters. Misleadingly, the government has described this as payments to plant trees. The new figures are said to be based on a 67% uptake in credits rather than a previously forecast 50% uptake, but no explanations given for the change in assumptions. So there's no provision for the financial impact of the emissions trading scheme after 2012. The excuse made for that, no international obligations after 2012. Mr Henare thinks it's boring to talk about climate change and sustainability. And doesn't he show the true colours of this government? Speak up more, Mr Henare. The country needs to hear more of it. Let's hear your commitment to the environment. Let's hear what you really think about the planet. Because the more you're caught out telling the truth, Mr Henare, on this budget and on the lack of commitment, the better. Sir, this was an irresponsible budget. It has no vision for any sort of brighter future for New Zealand. And, sir, at the next election, New Zealanders will give their verdict on it.